Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of Audio City. And today I have with me another interesting personality and speaker, and I'm referring to the gentleman by the name of Mr. Soumo Ganguly, who hails from India but currently is on a business assignment or a professional assignment in Nigeria. Hi, Soumo. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Kris. Thank you for having me on the show.
How was your experience in Nigeria?
Oh, it's been fantastic. It's been much better than people cautioned me about. It's a very dynamic economy. The people of Nigeria have a lot of energy and have the will to overcome challenges. So despite some of the macroeconomic issues in Nigeria, they are very, very energetic, positive, and always look forward to a better future.
So Soumo is as we call him, is the Deputy Managing Director of the Genesis Group, one of Nigeria's largest food service, hospitality, and cinema groups. And Mr. Ganguly joined the group in early 2016 as direct oversight of all business units as well as central and staff functions of marketing, sales, finance, HR, IT, and procurement. Prior to Genesis, he was a consultant covering consumer, media, entertainment, and food, retail, digital marketing, and sports, as well as private equity and in mergers and acquisitions. He has worked with KPMG, Nabis Capital, Infosys, and Milestone. Prior to consulting, Mr. Ganguly was a transaction coordinator for the law firm of Reed Smith. He obtained his BMP from the Asian Institute of Management, Manila, and a BA, a Bachelor's of Arts in Law, that is called BA LLB, from the National Law School of India, Bangalore.
Thank you so much. I think it was very, very kind of you to make such a grand introduction.
I would like to ask you, Soumo, how India changed its destiny as a destination for FDIs, for foreign direct investors or investments.
Okay, Kris. So I think if you go back in history, India was one of the middle-income countries for many, many years, and we had a confused economic policy, anywhere between socialism and state-backed capitalism, which didn't really work for the economy, but worked for a few families and the government. But in the early 90s, 1991, we had a economic crisis, and we had to go to the IMF for a bailout. And as a condition for the bailout, they forced us to make certain structural changes to the economy. That was led by our finance minister then, Dr. Manmohan Singh, who became prime minister for 10 years later on. But basically the shift that Dr. Singh made for the economy was based on India's demographic dividend, as he called it. We had a billion plus people, and those billion plus people were always looked at as poor and unable to afford consumer goods. He unleashed those people as consumers. So while on one hand we were able to present to the world that we had a billion plus consumers, we were also able to present that as a workforce, as a skilled workforce with great technical and engineering skills. That was luckily coupled with the Y2K problems that the Western world had in their IT systems. And that problem required Indian engineers to travel to the US, to Western Europe, to many parts of the world to try and fix what was called the Y2K bug. That really showed to the world that Indian engineers, Indian software personnel was capable of delivering world-class products and solutions to the world. While this was happening, there was increased investment by the largest multinational companies, right, from GE, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, ABB, Hitachi, coming into India, taking advantage of, firstly, the low-cost manufacturing that could have been possible in India, as well as the consumers that were requiring more stable power, water, housing, and civil services or municipal services. The third leg of the growth came from automotive companies. We were always stuck with old, dated technologies when it came to automobiles. Suzuki made a start with a joint venture called Maruti. And then in the late 90s, the floodgates opened, and every single auto company worth its salt, from the Koreans like Hyundai to the Japanese like Honda, Toyota, to the US, GM, Ford, high-end German models came in using India as a production base for export, as well as trying to tap into the middle class and upper middle class consumers that were developing in India. India by this time was also developing a good reputation as a export country. So whether it was textiles, software naturally, engineering products. So we were doing fairly well till then. And the next phase of the boom came when US companies especially started using India as a base for outsourcing software and contact center services, taking advantage of the time difference between the US and India. While the US went to sleep, workers in India were doing 24/7 call center support for companies, whether it was in insurance, banking, what have you. So by the middle of the first decade of 2000, India was very well positioned as both as an exporter of goods and services, as well as a large consumer of multinational products. We were still not fully integrated into the world economy, which is why when the 2008 financial crisis hit the US and the UK, India remained fairly insulated from that crisis. But that had other ramifications for us. We were hit by large banks withdrawing some of their assets and investments from India. And that taught India a lesson. It basically meant that India could no longer rely on quote-unquote hot money, which came into the stock markets and into financial products, but the focus should be more on FDI, which is foreign direct investment, which is more permanent capital, which is more capital that goes into building the structural blocks of an economy. Cut to 2014, there was a large wave in favor of a right-wing politician who has now been at the helm for about 5 years. And under Mr. Modi's leadership, there has been a big focus on Make in India, so domestic manufacturing, digital India, taking advantage of the startup ecosystem, and really harnessing the brain power that India has as one of the youngest nations in the world. Another significant milestone in India's journey towards a very strong FDI destination was based on public sector businesses. So right from the 1950s, the government has invested heavily in building their own capabilities to do heavy manufacturing, whether it's locomotives, whether it's shipbuilding, whether it's our own armed and ammunition. And those companies, which were still government owned, were able to make the transition into a liberalized market, and they could very well compete with some of the larger international players that were coming into India. So that in a nutshell is India's sort of journey in becoming a very strong FDI destination. Chris.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Shamo, about giving us this background and especially this information to the listeners. For listeners, at this moment I'm talking to Soumo Ganguly, popularly known as Shamo among his family and friends. The background noise, listeners, that you're hearing is because I've caught Shamo in the middle of some social activities going on in the background. But that's all about the spontaneity of Audio City. We spontaneously capture people on the audio stream. So just a question regarding the future. Where do you see this taking India to in the next 25 years? I mean, so in terms of some directions India might take. Just a quick 3 points on that.
Well, I think we first talk about the challenges. So India still has about 400 million people who are at poverty level or slightly above poverty level. So that's a challenge that every government has to address. And employment is still very big. There is a tendency for Indians to look for employment rather than become entrepreneurs and to generate employment. So that's an open challenge that every government has to face. On the opportunities side, I think the country is still very young. More than 60% of its population is below the age of 35. So there is a lot of employability, energy, youthfulness available that needs to be harnessed for it to benefit properly. For the next 20 years, I think a large part of the growth will come from digital, telecom, and internet-related services, which is now that India has got over 650 million smartphone users. I think that's a massive opportunity for us to move forward.
Okay, so now we just spoke about India, which is a macroeconomic situation, and just something very different. Of course, is not completely related to this topic. If you look at some countries which are way smaller than India, like say countries with a population of really lesser than 1 million, but who have kind of severe problems of inflation, problems of low GDP, also that you don't have enough industries in those countries, but they may be in mainland, they are maybe landlocked, or they are on the ocean front, and they have sufficient natural resources, but for some reason they have not developed and evolved. For countries like those, which are completely different from India, where India has, of course, all the natural resources that it requires, but it has a large consumer base. In those countries, the consumer base is really small. What would you think would such countries could learn from India from its evolution, and what do you think such countries could do to maybe attract FDIs or look at other ways of stabilizing their economies?
Yeah, so I think smaller countries with small populations and have a natural challenge, because once you have a small population, large organizations or corporations don't look at you as a potential market, so they're unlikely to invest heavily in those countries. But if you look at the Singapore model, I think that is a lesson that a lot of countries should take and learn from. Is how you harness your small population to deliver high class financial or tourism-related services or technology services. Of course, the key is corruption. And I think a lot of these smaller countries get stymied because of the lack of systems and processes and transparency. If one was to follow the Singapore model, it's very clear that these countries then become a pivot for offshore banking and financial and technology services, providing tourism, because they have usually very nice natural resources or land resources that could be attractive to tourists. So in my mind, I think that is the real focus. Instead of trying to emerge as a competitor to large countries, these smaller nations should play to their strengths, play to their small population, and develop as platforms for enabling transactions or services.
All right, so just one last question before we round it off, and that is, small countries, as you said, they have their challenges. Big countries have their own challenges, which are different. But when we speak about these younger countries, these smaller countries, do you think small countries like this could, gain, or investors in those countries or entrepreneurs could gain by partnering with entrepreneurs or investors, or maybe even investing in a country like India, where they could possibly generate have a larger income base because of a larger consumer group, and that could possibly minimize the risks of their business. And of course, if they have a hand-holding partner, India and those kind of countries could definitely help each other and evolve. Do you think is that maybe one kind of a model that could really work for these smaller countries?
Certainly could. A good example is Mauritius and how it's collaborated with India to become a very close ally and partner. They have a double taxation avoidance treaty. They have a textile manufacturing base that is mostly set up by Indian companies and then supplying to Europe. There's a good example of Costa Rica working and the Dominican Republic working with the United States of developing a close partnership. So certainly, I think if strategically done, small countries have enough niches to provide value adds to larger nations and build from there.
Soumo, do you have any message finally for the listeners, of any message that you might want to leave behind on behalf of India or on behalf of yourself?
No, I would really encourage people to look at India as a trading or as an investment partner. These are old countries, and you have ancestral links to these countries. So look back into your genealogy, into your family trees, and find connections so that you can start doing business with India. It all starts with one relationship or one link, and it can grow because India has a lot to offer and tremendous outbound investment opportunities coming out of India.
And this would also mean the same for investors from these countries into India too, right?
Absolutely. I think India would give you the red carpet and treat you very well.
Great. It was a pleasure speaking to Soumo Ganguly. Soumo, it was great to have you on air on the show. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Kris. It was a pleasure being on the show. Take care.
Okay, this is Kris DCosta signing off from this edition of Audio City.